The roar of splintering wood shattered the quiet afternoon air as the old Carson mercantile collapsed in on itself, sending a plume of dust billowing into the clear Montana sky. The year was 1887, and Hecla, Montana was experiencing the worst drought in decades, making the aged timber of the town's buildings as brittle as kindling. Levi Ingram was riding past on his chestnut mare when he heard the screams. He'd been on the trail for weeks, moving cattle from Wyoming to Montana, and had only stopped in Hecla to resupply before continuing north. The screaming sent a chill down his spine despite the scorching July heat. "Help! Somebody please help me!" The woman's voice was strained with panic and pain. Levi dismounted in one fluid motion, tying his horse to a hitching post before rushing toward the half-collapsed building. A small crowd had already gathered, their faces ashen with shock. "There's someone trapped in there," shouted a young boy, pointing frantically at the ruins of what had once been the general store. Without hesitation, Levi pushed through the onlookers, his tall frame and determined stride commanding respect. At 32, he had the hardened physique of a man who'd spent his life on horseback, roping cattle and sleeping under the stars. "Where exactly?" Levi asked, scanning the wreckage. "In the back," called an older man. "Miss O'Malley was checking inventory when the roof gave way." Levi didn't wait for more information. He plunged into the dusty haze, navigating carefully through the fallen beams and shattered shelving. The smell of dust, spilled kerosene, and dried goods filled his nostrils as he made his way deeper into the ruined store. "Hello," he called out. "Can you hear me?" "Yes." The voice was weaker now, tinged with fear. "I'm here. Please hurry. I can't feel my legs." Following the sound, Levi found her in what must have been the storeroom. Ruby O'Malley was pinned beneath a massive support beam that had crashed down from the ceiling. At 26, she was the town's schoolteacher and had been helping her uncle with inventory during the summer break. Her auburn hair was coated with dust, and a trickle of blood ran from a cut on her forehead. But it was her eyes that struck Levi the most deep green and filled with a mixture of terror and determination. "I'm going to get you out of here," Levi promised, crouching beside her. "Are you hurt badly?" Ruby tried to smile through her pain. "Just trapped the beam. It's crushing me." Levi assessed the situation quickly. The beam was massive solid oak and at least 15 feet long. If he tried to move it carelessly, the remaining structure could collapse entirely. "I'm Levi Ingram," he said, wanting to reassure her with the normalcy of introduction despite the dire circumstances. "I'm passing through with a cattle drive." "Ruby O'Malley," she replied, her voice shaky. "I teach at the schoolhouse. I'd offer to shake your hand, but—" She attempted a laugh that turned into a grimace. Levi smiled despite the situation. "Hold on, Miss O'Malley. I'm going to lift this beam, and when I do, I need you to pull yourself out if you can. If not, I'll drag you clear." Ruby nodded, gritting her teeth in preparation. Levi positioned himself beside the beam, planting his feet firmly and bending his knees. He'd lifted many heavy things in his life: hay bales, calves, even a wagon once when the wheel needed changing, but this would test the limits of his strength. "Ready?" he asked. "Yes," Ruby whispered. Levi took a deep breath and heaved upward with all his might. His muscles screamed in protest as the massive beam slowly rose. Sweat poured down his face, mingling with the dust. For a terrifying moment he thought he might not be strong enough, but then the beam lifted just enough. "Now." He grunted. Ruby tried to move, but her legs wouldn't respond. "I can't," she gasped. "I can't move my legs." Levi didn't hesitate. Maintaining his grip on the beam with one hand, a feat that made his arm tremble with the strain, he reached down with his other arm and grabbed Ruby around the waist. With a mighty effort, he pulled her free. then let the beam crash back down as he stumbled backward, cradling her against his chest. The impact of the beam hitting the floor sent a fresh wave of dust into the air, and somewhere above them, more wood creaked ominously. "We need to get out of here," Levi said, already moving toward the exit with Ruby in his arms. Her body was warm against his chest, her arms instinctively wrapping around his neck for security. They emerged from the ruined store to the sound of applause from the gathered townspeople. Ruby buried her face against Levi's shoulder, overwhelmed by the attention and the pain that was now shooting through her previously numb legs, a good sign, though she didn't know it yet. "Get the doctor," someone shouted. "Bring her to the hotel," called another voice. "It's closest." Levi didn't break stride as he carried Ruby down the dusty main street of Hecla toward the Silver Dollar Hotel. He was vaguely aware of people following them, of concerned questions being thrown his way, but all he could focus on was the woman in his arms and the need to get her somewhere safe. The Silver Dollar was a modest two-story building with peeling white paint and a wide porch. The owner, a stout woman named Martha Wilkins, was already holding the door open as Levi approached. "Upstairs, first room on the right," Martha directed. "Doc Sullivan's been sent for." Levi carried Ruby up the narrow staircase, acutely aware of how her body fit against his, of the faint scent of lavender that somehow cut through the dust and blood. He'd carried injured men before, cowboys thrown from horses or caught on the wrong end of a stampede, but never a woman, and certainly never one who stirred something so immediate and powerful within him. The room was small but clean, with a single bed, a washstand, and a chair by the window. Levi placed Ruby gently on the bed, careful not to jostle her unnecessarily. "Thank you," Ruby said softly, looking up at him with those remarkable green eyes. "You saved my life." Levi found himself momentarily speechless. In the better light of the hotel room, he could see that beneath the dust and blood, Ruby O'Malley was strikingly beautiful, with delicate features and a strength in her gaze that belied her current fragility. "Anyone would have done the same," he finally replied, stepping back from the bed. Ruby started to respond, but was interrupted by the arrival of Dr. Sullivan, a gray-haired man with spectacles and a perpetually worried expression. He was followed by a woman who introduced herself as Ruby's aunt, Eliza O'Malley, the wife of the store owner. "You gave us quite a scare, young lady," Dr. Sullivan said, setting his medical bag on the bedside table. "Now let's see what damage has been done." Levi moved toward the door, feeling suddenly out of place. "I should go," he said, tipping his hat. "I hope you recover quickly, Miss O'Malley." "Wait," Ruby called, wincing as she tried to sit up. "Please, what's your hurry? I haven't properly thanked you yet." "The cattle," Levi explained. "I've got a herd waiting north of town. My men can't hold them for long." Dr. Sullivan looked up from examining Ruby's legs. "You'll be pleased to know, Miss O'Malley, that there don't appear to be any broken bones, just severe bruising and some minor cuts. You're very fortunate." Relief flooded Ruby's face, but her eyes remained on Levi. "Will you be staying in town tonight, Mr. Ingram?" she asked. Levi hesitated. The trail boss would expect him back by nightfall. They had a schedule to keep, cattle to deliver, but something in Ruby's expression made it impossible for him to simply walk away. "I could return this evening," he found himself saying, "to check on your recovery." A smile brightened Ruby's dust-streaked face. "I'd like that very much." As Levi stepped out onto the hotel porch, he found himself wondering what had just happened. He'd ridden into Hecla intending to buy supplies and be back on the trail within an hour. Now, he was committed to returning, all because a schoolteacher with green eyes had asked him to. Levi rode north to rejoin his cattle drive, the events of the afternoon playing over in his mind. He'd been trailing cattle for 15 years, ever since he was 17 and his father died, leaving him to support his mother and younger sister. He'd seen his share of accidents and emergencies, had even pulled men from burning bunkhouses and rushing rivers. But something about today felt different. When he reached the herd, his trail boss, Frank Mulligan, was waiting with an impatient scowl. "Took your sweet time, Ingram," Mulligan grumbled. "Get what we needed." Levi dismounted, suddenly remembering he'd never actually purchased the supplies he'd gone to town for. "There was an accident," he explained. "The mercantile collapsed, had to help dig someone out." Mulligan's expression softened slightly. "Everyone all right? A woman was trapped." "I got her out, but she's pretty banged up." Levi hesitated, then added, "I told her I'd ride back tonight to check on her." Mulligan raised an eyebrow. "Did you now? And what about moving this herd at first light tomorrow?" "I'll be back," Levi promised. "Just want to make sure she's recovering." A knowing smile spread across Mulligan's weathered face. "Must be quite a woman to have you riding back and forth like a love-struck schoolboy." Levi felt heat rising in his cheeks that had nothing to do with the Montana sun. "It's not like that, just being neighborly." "Uh-huh," Mulligan chuckled. "Well, we'll hold here tonight anyway. The men could use a rest and the cattle need water, but we move out at dawn with or without you." "I'll be here," Levi assured him, though a small voice in the back of his mind wondered if he was making a promise he might regret keeping. As the sun began its descent toward the western mountains, Levi cleaned up as best he could at the creek, changing into his one decent shirt, a faded blue cotton affair that had seen better days, but was at least free of trail dust. He borrowed a razor from one of the other cowboys and carefully shaved the 2-week growth from his face, nicking himself only once in his haste. The other men watched his preparations with barely concealed amusement. "You sure clean up nice, Ingram," called one of the younger hands. "This lady must be something special." "Just being respectful," Levi muttered, though he knew his actions betrayed a deeper interest than mere courtesy would require. He rode back into Hecla as the last rays of sunlight gilded the mountains to the west. The town was quieter now, though a few people still milled about in front of the saloon. Several nodded to him in recognition as he passed the man who'd pulled the schoolteacher from the collapsed building. At the $Silver Hotel, Levi tied his horse and straightened his shirt before stepping inside. Martha Wilkins was behind the small reception desk and looked up as he entered. "Ah, the hero returns," she said with a smile. "She's been asking about you." Levi felt an unexpected flutter in his chest. "How is she?" "Doing well, considering. Doc says she'll be sore for weeks, but no lasting damage." Martha came around the desk. "She's in the dining room. Insisted on coming down for supper instead of eating in her room like a sensible person would." Martha led him to a small room at the back of the hotel, where several tables were set up. Only 2 were occupied, one by a traveling salesman absorbed in paperwork, the other by Ruby O'Malley. She was cleaned up now, her auburn hair falling in soft waves past her shoulders, the cut on her forehead neatly bandaged. She wore a simple blue dress that brought out the color of her eyes, and though she sat stiffly, clearly still in pain, she brightened visibly when she saw Levi. "Mr. Ingram," she said, her voice warmer and stronger than it had been that afternoon. "You came back." "I said I would," Levi replied, removing his hat as he approached her table. "And please call me Levi." "Then you must call me Ruby," she said, gesturing to the empty chair across from her. "Will you join me for supper? It's the least I can offer after what you did today." Levi sat down, suddenly aware of how long it had been since he'd shared a meal with anyone who wasn't a cowboy or a trail cook. "How are you feeling?" he asked. "Like I've been kicked by a mule," Ruby admitted with a small laugh. "But Dr. Sullivan says I'm lucky. if the beam had fallen just a few inches to the left. She shuddered slightly. Well, let's just say I'm very grateful you happened to be passing by. A young girl appeared with 2 plates of food: roast beef, potatoes, and green beans, setting them down before quickly retreating. I took the liberty of ordering for you, Ruby explained. I hope you don't mind. The roast beef is the best thing on the menu. Levi smiled, touched by her thoughtfulness. It looks delicious, thank you. As they ate, Ruby asked him about his life on the cattle trail, listening with genuine interest as he described the long days and longer nights, the challenges of moving thousands of head of cattle across rugged terrain, and the camaraderie that developed among men who faced the elements together. In turn, Levi learned that Ruby had come to Hecla 3 years earlier to take the teaching position after growing up in St. Louis. Her parents had died from influenza when she was 18, and she'd worked as a governess before obtaining her teaching certificate and heading west for adventure and independence. Teaching in Hecla isn't quite the adventure I imagined, she confessed, but I love the children, and there's something about this land that speaks to my soul. Levi understood that feeling all too well. The open country gets in your blood, he agreed. I've seen more beautiful sunsets from a bedroll than most people see in a lifetime. As they talked, Levi found himself captivated not just by Ruby's beauty, but by her intelligence, her quiet strength, and her ability to find humor even in the aftermath of her ordeal. He couldn't remember the last time he'd enjoyed a conversation this much. All too soon, the reality of his situation intruded. I have to ride out with the herd at dawn, Levi said reluctantly as they finished their meal. Disappointment flickered across Ruby's face. Of course. You have responsibilities. She hesitated, then asked, Will your trail take you back through Hecla? Levi shook his head. No, we're headed straight north to Fort Benton from here. He didn't add that after delivering the cattle, he'd be returning to Wyoming in the opposite direction from Hecla. I see, Ruby said softly. Well, I'm glad you came back tonight. It's not every day a woman gets to thank her rescuer properly. Levi felt a pang of regret so acute it surprised him. He'd known this woman less than a day, yet the thought of never seeing her again seemed unbearable. But what choice did he have? His life was on the trail, moving from job to job, place to place. He'd never stayed anywhere long enough to put down roots, never thought he'd want to. Perhaps I could write to you, he suggested, the words coming out before he'd fully thought them through. Ruby's expression brightened. I'd like that. Very much. They exchanged a few more minutes of conversation before Dr. Sullivan arrived to check on Ruby and insist she return to her room to rest. Levi helped her stand, supporting her as she winced from the pain in her bruised body. I can manage from here, she assured him at the foot of the stairs, though her face was pale with the effort of walking even that short distance. Are you sure? Levi asked, reluctant to leave her. Yes. Ruby smiled up at him. You have an early start tomorrow. I wouldn't want to be responsible for keeping you from your duties. Levi knew she was right, but still he lingered. I'll write as soon as we reach Fort Benton, he promised. I'll look forward to it. Ruby hesitated, then leaned forward and kissed his cheek, a gesture so brief and light he might have imagined it. Goodbye, Levi Ingram, and thank you for everything. With that, she turned and slowly made her way up the stairs, pausing once to look back at him before disappearing down the hallway. Levi stood there for a long moment, his hand unconsciously touching the spot where her lips had been. Then, with a heavy sigh, he put on his hat and walked out into the night, wondering why the prospect of returning to the life he'd led for 15 years suddenly felt so empty. The cattle drive to Fort Benton was uneventful, which should have been a relief but instead left Levi with too much time to think. As he rode alongside the lumbering herd, His mind kept returning to Ruby O'Malley, her smile, her courage, the way her hair caught the light. He found himself composing letters to her in his head, describing the scenery they passed, sharing anecdotes from the trail, asking questions about her day-to-day life in Hecla. When they finally reached Fort Benton 10 days later, Levi wasted no time in finding paper and pen. He settled at a table in the back of a quiet saloon and wrote his first letter to Ruby, careful to keep his tone friendly but not overly familiar. He described the rest of the journey, mentioned a particularly spectacular sunset they'd witnessed, and asked after her recovery. He concluded by providing the address of the ranch in Wyoming where he'd be working for the next few months. After mailing the letter, Levi tried to put Ruby out of his mind and focus on the job at hand. The cattle were delivered, payment received, and the men began to disperse to their next assignments. Mulligan offered Levi a position on another drive starting in 2 weeks, but for the first time in his career, Levi found himself hesitating. "Need some time to think on it," he told the surprised trail boss. "This wouldn't have anything to do with that schoolteacher back in Hecla, would it?" Mulligan asked knowingly. Levi didn't answer directly. "I'll let you know in a few days." He rode south with several of the other cowboys, but instead of continuing all the way to Wyoming, Levi found himself turning west at a fork in the trail. He told himself he was just taking a slight detour, that he'd continue on to Wyoming after making one quick stop in Hecla to check on Ruby. It wasn't as if he was making any permanent decisions. The ride took 3 days. As Hecla came into view, Levi felt a mixture of anticipation and nervousness. What if Ruby's interest had been merely gratitude? What if she'd already forgotten him? Worse, what if she remembered him all too well but had no interest in seeing him again? Hecla looked much the same as when he'd left it nearly 2 weeks earlier, with one notable exception. The Carson mercantile was being rebuilt. Men swarmed over the skeleton of the new structure, hammering and sawing in the late summer heat. Levi rode directly to the schoolhouse, a small white building at the edge of town. School was in session, judging by the children's voices he could hear through the open windows. He dismounted and tied his horse, then hesitated, suddenly unsure of himself. Would Ruby welcome this unannounced visit, or would she find it presumptuous? Before he could decide whether to knock or retreat, the schoolhouse door opened and children began pouring out. Recess, he realized. And then he saw her, standing in the doorway, watching her students with a fond smile. She looked fully recovered, moving with ease as she stepped outside. She didn't notice him at first, her attention on a young boy who was showing her something clutched in his small hand. Levi watched, mesmerized by the gentle way she interacted with the child, the animation in her face as she examined whatever treasure he'd presented. Then she looked up, and her eyes met Levi's across the schoolyard. For a heart-stopping moment, her expression was blank, uncomprehending. Then recognition dawned, followed by surprise, and was he imagining it? Joy. "Mr. Ingram," she called, crossing the yard toward him, her skirts swishing against the dry grass. "Miss O'Malley," he replied, removing his hat. "I was passing through and thought I'd check on your recovery." It was a flimsy excuse, and they both knew it. Fort Benton to Wyoming was not a route that naturally included Hecla, Montana. "What a wonderful surprise," Ruby said, her smile making his heart race. "The children are at recess for another 15 minutes. Would you care to sit?" She gestured to a bench under a cottonwood tree at the edge of the schoolyard. "I'd be honored," Levi replied, following her to the bench. "You look well," he observed. "Fully recovered." "Almost," Ruby said, sitting carefully. "I still have some colorful bruises, but the pain is mostly gone. Dr. Sullivan says I was very lucky." She studied him for a moment. "I received your letter yesterday. I didn't expect you to visit in person so soon after writing." "Neither did I," Levi admitted. "It wasn't exactly a planned detour." Ruby's eyes sparkled with amusement. "A spontaneous 3-day ride just to check on my health. I'm flattered, Mr. Ingram." "Levi," he reminded her. "And yes, it seems I couldn't stay away. I've thought about you every day since I left Hecla." The directness of his statement seemed to surprise them both. Ruby's cheeks flushed, and Levi felt his own face growing warm. He hadn't intended to be so forthright, but now that the words were out, he found he didn't regret them. "I've thought about you too," Ruby confessed softly. "I was already composing my reply to your letter. I had so many questions I wanted to ask." "Ask them now," Levi suggested. "I'm right here." Ruby laughed, a sound that Levi immediately wanted to hear again. "There are too many for a 15-minute recess. But perhaps—" She hesitated, then continued with quiet determination. "Perhaps you might join me for supper again. I have my own cottage now. My uncle rebuilt it after I started teaching here. It's small, but I could cook for you." Levi knew he should be cautious. A man and woman dining alone in her home would raise eyebrows in a small town like Hecla. But the thought of spending more time with Ruby outweighed any concern for gossip. "I'd be delighted," he said. "What time shall I call on you?" Ruby gave him directions to her cottage and suggested 6 o'clock. Their conversation was cut short by the end of recess, and Levi watched as she efficiently herded her students back into the schoolhouse, casting one last smile in his direction before closing the door. Levi spent the afternoon securing a room at the Silver Dollar Hotel and tidying himself up as best he could. He purchased a new shirt from the partially rebuilt mercantile, now operating out of a tent while construction continued on the main building. He even bought a small bunch of wildflowers from a girl selling them on the street corner. At precisely 6 o'clock, he knocked on the door of Ruby's cottage, flowers in hand and heart pounding with an anticipation he hadn't felt since he was a green youth courting his first sweetheart. Ruby opened the door, and Levi's breath caught. She had changed out of her practical teaching dress into a sage green gown that perfectly complemented her eyes. Her hair was partially up, with soft tendrils framing her face. "You look beautiful," Levi said, the words escaping before he could consider them. Ruby's smile was radiant. "Thank you. Please come in." She accepted the wildflowers with evident delight. "These are lovely. Let me put them in water." The cottage was indeed small, just a combined sitting room and kitchen, with what Levi presumed was a bedroom through the single door at the back. But it was cozy and immaculately kept, with books lining one wall and simple but tasteful furnishings. "It's not much," Ruby said, returning from placing the flowers in a jar on the table, "but it's home." "It suits you," Levi observed, noting the personal touches that spoke of Ruby's character: the neat stack of student papers on a small desk, the colorful quilt draped over the back of a rocking chair, the collection of polished stones arranged on the mantel. The meal Ruby had prepared was simple but delicious: roast chicken, mashed potatoes, green beans fresh from someone's garden, and apple pie for dessert. As they ate, they talked, picking up their conversation where they'd left off that afternoon. Levi learned that Ruby had originally come west because she'd read dime novels about frontier adventures as a girl, and had always dreamed of experiencing the wildness of Montana for herself. She admitted with a laugh that the reality was both more mundane and more rewarding than she'd imagined. Teaching these children, watching them grow and learn, it's a different kind of adventure, but no less meaningful, she explained. "Still, sometimes I wonder what it would be like to see more of this country, to experience the kind of freedom you must have in your travels." "Freedom comes with its own price," Levi said thoughtfully. "No real home, few lasting connections. Sometimes I envy folks who have put down roots." The conversation flowed easily between them, touching on their childhoods, their dreams, their views on everything from politics to literature. Levi found himself sharing thoughts he'd never voiced aloud to anyone, his secret desire to someday have land of his own, his occasional loneliness on the trail, despite being surrounded by other cowboys, his fear that he might spend his whole life wandering without ever finding a place that felt like home. Ruby listened attentively, her questions insightful, her responses free of judgment. When Levi mentioned his mother and sister back in Wyoming, the family he supported, but rarely saw, Ruby's eyes softened with understanding. "Family is complicated," she said. "I love my aunt and uncle dearly, but sometimes I feel like an obligation to them rather than a joy. Especially after the accident, they've been hovering over me as if I might break at any moment." "You're stronger than they realize," Levi observed. Ruby looked at him with surprise and pleasure. "Most people see a schoolteacher and think fragile or proper. They don't look deeper." "I see you," Levi said simply. The evening passed too quickly. Before Levi knew it, the mantel clock was striking 10, and propriety demanded that he take his leave. At the door, he hesitated, not wanting the evening to end but unable to think of a reason to prolong it that wouldn't compromise Ruby's reputation. "When do you have to leave Hecla?" Ruby asked, her voice carefully neutral. "I should head to Wyoming soon," Levi admitted. "I'm expected at the Double R Ranch by the end of the month." "So you have some time yet," Ruby observed, hope evident in her tone. "A few days," Levi confirmed. "Would you? That is, might I call on you again tomorrow?" Ruby's smile was answer enough, but she added, "I'd be disappointed if you didn't. Perhaps we could take a walk after school lets out. I could show you around Hecla properly." "I'd like that very much," Levi said. There was a moment of silence, both of them reluctant to say goodbye. Then, gathering his courage, Levi took Ruby's hand and raised it to his lips, pressing a gentle kiss to her knuckles. "Until tomorrow, Ruby O'Malley," he said softly. Ruby's cheeks flushed, but she didn't withdraw her hand immediately. "Until tomorrow, Levi Ingram." As Levi walked back to the hotel under a canopy of stars, he realized with startling clarity that his life had irreversibly changed the moment he'd lifted that beam off Ruby O'Malley. Whatever path he'd been on before had forked, and he was now traveling in a direction he'd never anticipated but couldn't regret. The next 3 days passed in a blur of stolen moments and growing affection. Levi met Ruby after school each afternoon, and they explored Hecla together, walking by the creek that ran behind the town, visiting the small church where Ruby taught Sunday school, climbing the hill at the edge of town to watch the sunset. In the evenings, they alternated between dining at the hotel and having simple suppers at Ruby's cottage. Each conversation deepened their connection, each shared laugh and thoughtful discussion drawing them closer. Levi found himself sharing hopes and dreams he'd never articulated before, while Ruby revealed her own aspirations and fears with equal candor. On the 4th day, as they sat on the porch of Ruby's cottage watching fireflies dance in the gathering dusk, Levi knew he couldn't delay the inevitable any longer. "I have to leave tomorrow," he said, breaking a comfortable silence. Ruby nodded, her expression calm though her eyes betrayed her sadness. "I know. I've been thinking." Levi began, then faltered, unsure how to express the tumult of emotions and half-formed plans swirling in his mind. "About," Ruby prompted gently. Levi took a deep breath. "About what happens next. Between us, I mean." "What do you want to happen, Levi?" Ruby asked, her directness both challenging and reassuring. "I want to come back," he said simply. "When my work in Wyoming is done, if you'd welcome that." Ruby's smile was like the sun breaking through clouds. I would welcome that very much. It would be months, Levi warned. Not until the spring thaw, most likely. I'll wait, Ruby said, her voice steady. We can write in the meantime. Levi reached for her hand, drawing comfort from the warmth of her fingers entwined with his. I've never felt this way about anyone before, he admitted. It terrifies me and exhilarates me in equal measure. I know exactly what you mean, Ruby replied softly. When I saw you today walking toward the schoolhouse, my heart nearly jumped out of my chest. It's as if. She paused, searching for words. As if something I didn't even know I was missing suddenly appeared. Unable to resist any longer, Levi leaned forward and kissed her. It was a gentle, questioning kiss at first, but when Ruby responded with equal fervor, it deepened into something more profound, a promise, a declaration, a beginning. When they finally parted, both slightly breathless, Levi rested his forehead against Ruby's. I'll write every week, he promised. And I'll be counting the days until spring. As will I, Ruby whispered. The following morning, Levi rode out of Hecla with the taste of Ruby's goodbye kiss still on his lips and her final words echoing in his mind. I'll be here when you return. Don't forget what you're riding toward, Levi Ingram. The autumn and winter that followed were the longest of Levi's life. He threw himself into his work at the Double R Ranch, earning a reputation as one of the hardest working hands they'd ever employed. But every free moment was devoted to writing letters to Ruby, long, detailed accounts of his days, his thoughts, his growing certainty that what they had found together in those few days in Hecla was rare and precious. Ruby's letters in return were equally heartfelt. She wrote of her students, of the changing seasons in Hecla, of books she was reading and thoughts she was thinking. Between the lines, Levi could sense her loneliness, mirroring his own but also her steadfastness. Neither of them questioned whether their separation was temporary. It was simply a trial to be endured before they could be together again. As winter deepened, Levi made a decision that would alter the course of his life. He wrote to Ruby explaining his plan. He had saved nearly every penny he'd earned over the past 15 years, sending most of it to his mother and sister, but keeping enough to someday buy a small spread of his own. Now, he proposed using that money to purchase land near Hecla, not to build a cattle empire, but to establish a modest horse ranch where he could raise and train the quarter horses he'd worked with his entire life. It won't make me rich, he wrote, but it would be a solid living. More importantly, it would mean putting down roots, near you, if that's something you might welcome. Ruby's response came faster than usual, the pages filled with enthusiastic support for his idea. Hecla needs good horses, she wrote. And I need you nearby, not hundreds of miles away for months at a time. Throughout the winter, they refined the plan through their correspondence. Ruby inquired about available land around Hecla and reported back on several promising options. Levi researched what it would take to transport his small herd of personally owned horses, 4 mares and a stallion he'd carefully selected and trained over the years from Wyoming to Montana. By March, as the first hints of spring began to soften the harsh Wyoming landscape, everything was in place. Levi gave notice at the Double R, said goodbye to his fellow ranch hands, and prepared for the journey north. He sent one final letter to Ruby, confirming his planned arrival in mid-April and containing one additional question, the most important he'd ever asked. The journey to Hecla was arduous, with late-season snowstorms and swollen creeks slowing his progress. Levi pushed on, driven by the thought of seeing Ruby again, of beginning the life they'd planned through their winter correspondence. His small herd of horses followed the mare he led, their presence a tangible symbol of his commitment to this new path. It was the first week of May when Levi finally crested the ridge overlooking Hecla. The town looked different in the fresh green of spring than it had in the dry heat of the previous summer. The mercantile had been completely rebuilt, and several new buildings had sprung up along the main street. But it was the figure standing at the edge of town that drew Levi's attention. Ruby was waiting just as she'd promised, her red hair vivid against the pale blue of her dress. As Levi rode down toward her, leading his small herd, he saw her hand rise to her mouth, saw her take a step forward, then another, and then she was running toward him. Levi dismounted in one fluid motion and caught Ruby in his arms, lifting her off her feet in his enthusiasm. She laughed as he spun her around, her hands clutching his shoulders. "You're here," she breathed when he finally set her down. "You're really here." "I promised I would be," Levi replied, drinking in the sight of her eyes brighter and more beautiful than he'd remembered, her smile wider, her presence more vital and necessary than he could have imagined during their long separation. "I got your last letter," Ruby said, her cheeks flushing. "The one with the question." Levi's heart raced. He'd written the words in a moment of absolute certainty, but the weeks of travel had given him ample time for doubt to creep in. What if he'd presumed too much? What if Ruby wanted more time? "And?" he asked, trying to keep his voice steady. Ruby's smile was radiant. "Yes," she said simply. "Yes, Levi Ingram, I will marry you." Joy surged through Levi, so intense it was almost painful. He pulled Ruby close and kissed her, pouring months of longing and hope into the embrace. Around them, his horses nickered and stamped, as if offering their approval of this union that would give them all a permanent home. When they finally broke apart, both breathless and laughing, Ruby gestured toward the town. "I have something to show you," she said, taking his hand. "While you were gone, I might have made a few arrangements of my own." Curious, Levi tied his horse and instructed his trail hand to take the rest of the herd to the livery stable where he'd arranged boarding. Then he followed Ruby through town, noting the friendly nods and knowing smiles directed their way. Clearly, their correspondence and his impending return had been subjects of local interest. Ruby led him to the outskirts of town, to a modest but well-maintained cabin set on several acres of good land. A small barn stood nearby and a creek ran along the property's edge. "What's this?" Levi asked, though he was beginning to suspect the answer. "Home," Ruby said simply. "If you approve." It belonged to old Mr. Fletcher, who passed away in February. His children live in California and had no interest in keeping the place. When they put it up for sale, I took the liberty of securing it. It has everything you said you wanted for your horse ranch, including good grazing land and access to water. Levi stared at her in amazement. "You bought this? For us?" Ruby nodded, a hint of uncertainty creeping into her expression. "I used the money my parents left me. I've been saving it for something important, and this felt right. But if you don't like it, or if you had somewhere else in mind," Levi silenced her with a kiss. "It's perfect," he said when they parted. "You're perfect. I can't believe you did this." "I wanted to contribute to our future," Ruby explained. "I don't plan to stop teaching, at least not right away, but I wanted to help build something that would be ours together." Levi took her hands in his, overwhelmed by the depth of her commitment. "I love you, Ruby O'Malley. More than I have words to express." "I love you too, Levi Ingram," she replied softly. "Welcome home." They were married 2 weeks later in the small church where Ruby taught Sunday school. The entire town turned out for the celebration, including Ruby's aunt and uncle, who had come to grudgingly approve of the match after seeing how happy Ruby was with Levi. As spring turned to summer, they settled into their new life together. Levi began building his horse business. using the skills he'd honed over years on various ranches to train quality mounts that quickly gained a reputation throughout the region. Ruby continued teaching, but now she rode home each afternoon to their ranch where Levi was invariably waiting, eager to hear about her day and share details of his own. They worked side by side to improve their property, adding to the cabin, expanding the barn, planting a vegetable garden that Ruby tended with the same care she gave her students. In the evenings, they sat on their porch watching the sunset, making plans, sharing dreams, marveling at how a collapsed building and a fallen beam had changed both their lives irrevocably. By the following spring, Ruby was expecting their first child. She continued teaching until the end of the school term, then devoted herself to preparing for the baby's arrival. Levi expanded his business, hiring 2 hands to help with the increasing number of horses being brought to him for training. Their son, James, was born on a crisp October morning, healthy, strong, and with a set of lungs that, as the midwife remarked, would serve him well if he decided to follow his father into calling cattle. "He's perfect," Levi whispered, holding his son for the first time, his eyes wet with tears of joy and gratitude. "He is," Ruby agreed, exhausted but radiant. "And he's ours." As James grew from infant to toddler, the ranch prospered. Levi's reputation as a horse trainer spread, bringing clients from as far away as Idaho and Wyoming. Ruby returned to teaching part-time, bringing James with her to a small nursery area she'd set up in the corner of the schoolroom. When James was 3, he was joined by a sister, Sarah, whose auburn hair and green eyes marked her as her mother's daughter, though her determined personality reminded everyone of her father. The years passed in a rhythm of seasons and milestones: first steps, first words, first days of school. The ranch expanded to include cattle as well as horses, and Levi hired more hands to manage the growing operation. Ruby eventually became the headmistress of the Hecla School, instituting progressive teaching methods that drew praise from educational authorities in Helena. Through it all, through the busy days and peaceful nights, through arguments and reconciliations, through moments of doubt and periods of absolute certainty, Levi and Ruby's love for each other remained the constant center of their world. They never forgot how they'd met, how a moment of crisis had brought them together and changed the course of both their lives. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Levi surprised Ruby with a special gift: a small carved wooden beam, polished to a high shine, with their initials and the date of the mercantile collapse etched into one side. "To remind us where it all began," he explained as Ruby turned the carving over in her hands, "under a fallen beam that turned out to be the luckiest accident of my life." "Our life," Ruby corrected, leaning into his embrace, "and I wouldn't change a moment of it." As the sun set over their ranch, casting long shadows across the land they'd built together, Levi held his wife close and silently thanked whatever twist of fate had led him to ride through Hecla on that summer day so many years before. What had seemed like chance, a collapsed building, a woman in peril, a cowboy happening by at the right moment, had turned out to be the beginning of everything that mattered.